Tishani Doshi is an award-winning poet and a dancer of Welsh Gujarati descent. She was born in Madras, India in 1975. She received her master's in writing from Johns Hopkins University in America and worked in London in advertising before returning to India in 2001 to work with the choreographer Chandralekha, with whom she performed on many international stages. An avid traveler, she has been trekking in the Ethiopian Bale Mountains, visited Antarctica with a group of high school students, and documented the largest transgender gathering in Kuvakam. She has written about her travels in newspapers such as The Guardian, International Herald Tribune, The Hindu, and the Financial Times, and has interviewed over 100 writers about the craft of writing, including Diana Athill, Hector Abad, Deborah Levy, Michael Odanteji, Banana Yoshimoto, and George Saunders. She was an Eric Gregory Award for her poetry. She won an Eric Gregory Award for her poetry in 2001. In 2006, she won the All Indian Poetry Competition, and her debut collection, Countries of the Body, won the Forward Prize for Best First Collection. Her first novel, The Pleasure Seekers, Bloomsbury 2010, was longlisted for the Orange Prize and shortlisted for the Hindu Literary Award, and translated into several languages. Her second poetry collection, Everything Begins Elsewhere, was published by Bloodaxe Books in 2012. Fountainville New Stories from the Mabinogion was published by Seren in 2013. Her third collection, Girls Are Coming Out of the Woods, by Bloodaxe Books in 2018, was a poetry book society recommendation and was shortlisted for the Ted Hughes Award for New Work in Poetry in 2018 in the UK, and for the poetry category of the 2019 Firecracker Awards in the US. Her second novel, Small Days and Nights by Bloomsbury 2019, was shortlisted for the RSL Advantage Prize. For her fourth book, a poetry collection, A God at the Door, was published by Bloodaxe in 2021. Tishani Doshi lives on a beach between two fishing villages in Tamil Nadu with her husband and dogs. She is currently visiting Associate Professor of Practice, Literature and Creative Writing at New York University, Abu Dhabi. That is phenomenal biography. And I read a lot of to have a filler, and they get longer and longer. Yours has no filler, and somehow it is quite long. It seems like you've earned every notch on it. Do you think, and before we get to it, because I know that we've discussed this, do you think a writer has an obligation to live an interesting life?
I don't think writers have obligations per se, not even to write. I think that when you come to writing, you're somebody who's sort of not wired to necessarily think of obligations. At least I don't. And I think the question of interesting is, it's not a prerequisite to have an interesting life to write, although it helps. But I think a lot of writers have talked about how in order to write, you have to create the most boring of lives. You have to live, I think it was Flaubert who said, you have to live like a clerk. A lot of writers have compared it to like being a monk or staying in a jail, or all of this idea of a monastic kind of life, which doesn't seem to be very interesting. And I think the point is that you create a routine, you create a sort of system whereby then the imagination has this freedom, and the imagination should be interesting. I don't know necessarily that the life has to be interesting, but yeah, if you didn't have interesting imagination, I think you would suffer as a writer.
I think that that's the answer that Kafka would have preferred, because his life was terribly, terribly dull. But I do wonder that, so much of your life seems to come in through your work. Do you find that it feeds your imagination? I know that in other interviews you've discussed how moving away from the city has really changed the way that you handle your work and you think about work itself.
I think that the sense of movement or displacement has been important for me. Travel has been important, movement in general, whether it's from city to coastal village or whether it's from country to country. I've lived in different countries. I think there's a sense of grappling with identity, which has always been very important to me, a sense of belonging, finding one's place in the world that goes through poems, fiction, as a kind of continuous theme. And so it's also this search for uh, selfhood, um, which I think is fairly common for writers. But it's also trying to connect, I guess, the micro to the macro, not just finding oneself, but then once you are on this path, how do you then connect self to the larger world, and what are the connections that you can make, and what are the breakages, what are the areas that you want to explore. So yeah, I think for me that's been very important, this sort of very strange dynamic between sitting still for long periods of time and then frantic movement, and then sitting still and frantic movement. And perhaps tying in with your first question, that sense of having little windows where there is place for living life, and those interesting things that happen that make up life are available to you, but then kind of having a moment, or many moments of sitting quite quietly to digest and to process and to have a more sort of routine and mechanical way of life. And I used to have a real fear of the mechanical, that sense that it creates aridness or dryness, and I felt that things always needed to come from a place of, like, creativity is a sensuality for me, and it needed to come from this richness. But I think after having worked as a dancer and a writer, I really have embraced the idea of repetition, of arriving day after day, of going through the same movements, of going through the same routines, because it's through those repetitions that then something happens, that something lifts, something changes, something that you sense as exciting when you're working, that you have you know uh, made a leap that you could not have expected to make.
So I have a few questions, and I know that I'm straying from the original plan, but you have to forgive me. Your writing is very interesting. Um, so you mentioned a couple of things that were really interesting to me. One, this idea of identity and belonging, and obviously it being central to writing. Correct me if I'm wrong, but it feels very much like in your last book, which I read last night, in a mad joyous dash. Um, it seemed like the writer, the voice, was moving through more than one identity. So I'm very curious as to, if I read it wrong, please correct me and set me straight. But if I'm reading it right, then I would like to hear your thoughts on identity and how they connect to belonging and place, because they seem very tethered throughout the book and throughout the rest of your work that I've been able to find.
Well, there's this wonderful freedom that comes with writing, whether it's poetry or fiction, which is an assumption of forms, an assumption of personalities, an assumption of speakers. The Whitman's I sense of, I contain multitudes, this sense of many worlds within us, many imagination, many lives that we can access somehow and that we channel. And it's very exhilarating. And I think, given that we are very much structured with a sense of identity politics as writers, woman writer from India, writing about XYZ, and you're framed always with certain lenses by other people, by yourself. And then I think always what you're trying to do with writing is that, yes, you come with these prisms, yes, you come with these identities, but when you are writing, you are also trying to escape those, or to try and wiggle into something else. And that's exhilarating. And I feel that a lot in fiction, but also with poems, this sense of the poem as a universe, one small little world, that you create. And that within that, you can make these very giant leaps So there can be movement on a large scale, even in a small thing like a poem. And of course, in a novel, the possibilities are endless, and it's really built to kind of explore these different senses of eyes, voices, characters, worlds. So it's incredible. It's an incredible power, I think, of writing. And I don't know that we necessarily sit down and think about it consciously when we begin as writers, but certainly I think that is one of the superpowers of writing, is that you do get to channel these different senses of selves, as you go about your process.
Have you Do you feel like you're capable of creating more of those spaces for escape as you mature as a writer? Or I don't always like using the word mature as a writer because it kind of makes it sound like there's this linear progression, whereas I feel like I've sort of expanded as a writer into all these different changes, and one gets bored with one's own work. That doesn't mean that the old work was not mature unto itself. So I'm curious about how you conceive of your skill set to create this escapist spaces.
I mean, there's always a feeling, coming back to the idea of movement that I talked about, which is what you're trying to do when you write and in life as well. And you're right, it's not a sense of linear, there's not a progression. It's just that, oh, you're here and then suddenly you're there. And how did that happen? It's interesting to examine these leaps as they occur. And in writing, it's also very simply a question of learning to manipulate or to understand the trickeries of these movements and how to create them and how to make them happen. I think voice is obviously very important, and maybe the more you write, the more confident you feel about taking on voices that may not be as close to the voice that you think is the most yourself, or you develop this kind of choral sense of having different voices. I don't know. I don't know that I have an answer to that. I feel that it's a very sacred space, and I use the word sacred not lightly, because I think a lot of the discussions that are happening about writing now are about who gets to tell what story, which I think is a very important
Mm.
it's a very important dialogue and discussion to have. But I also wonder how we can have that without creating these limitations, which say, well, no, you cannot write about this, and I only can write about this. Or how do you? So then it's like curtailing the imagination, which comes back to the idea of where was the freedom in writing in the first place. So I think it's an interesting time to be writing, to be asking these questions, and to be trying to figure things out with my own work. And I feel very lucky, I think, to be able to write in different genres, because I do think that poetry has its frameworks, and fiction has its frameworks, and the essay has its frameworks. And there are things that maybe you can do in a poem and you want to say, and then other things that are better done in an essay. And it's only through the exploration of form that you find the right fit, let's say.
I I'm really trying hard to like get back into line, but it's rare that you read a book, especially because I read it last night, and then you end up with all these questions, and then somebody tells you, "Oh, you get to ask the author every question that you had last night." So I'm possibly having too much fun, and Profor is gonna have a nightmare editing all of these as I'm all over the place. But I'm very curious about a couple of things. You already mentioned about curtailing imagination. I think I'd love to enter that question through the question of form that we discussed earlier. So for example, I destroyed my ACL early on in my youth after being a really, really active person. And it was when I destroyed my ACL that I started experimenting a little bit more with the way that the page looked, how I
Mm,
could arrange the words on that page, because I had always envisioned the text as a physical body of sorts. And to sort of slash the physical body of the page felt very much like the most true version to express the way that I felt at that moment. So I'm curious how you feel having this relationship with your own body. How do you feel about the body of a text? Do you think about it as a body when you start manipulating it? Or is it completely metaphysical because you feel and you exist so much in your body? Do you escape into a sort of formless in place without an embodiment? How do you conceive a form and then begin to play with it?
It's really the big question for me, and the big preoccupation. And I don't know, again, that I have a direct answer. I know that as a dancer, whereby you use your body as the first sort of outpost, the first interface, the basic, it's the raw material. That's what you take onto the stage. Um, I know that I've invested a lot in that sense of the physicality and the realness and the sureness of the body and all of its fragilities and all of its powers. And I've been exploring that also as a writer. Uh, and then I've also been trying to go the other way of bringing that into the writing. And, during the pandemic, it was very interesting because I felt like a lot of people increasingly disembodied in my experiences because the body was really caged in and we weren't allowed to be with other bodies in the same way, and the body was a threat. And also we were doing everything through the screen, so it was a very flattened out, disembodied experience. And I felt like a lot of the poems in this collection, for instance, are concrete or shape poems. And it was because I wanted to give shape to the poem and shape to the particular time that we were going through. So suddenly it became very important to actually signal form on the page in some way. So I like the idea of shape and form in poetry very much. And I think there's also a very deep connection between the idea of shape and sound. So I think in poetry it comes together very well. So I have a lot of fun, and I love the idea of play as well. I think for me that has become something increasingly important to do as a writer. This sense of, I wanted to not be too precious about everything, to have a sense of irreverence, and to make fun of myself, to make fun of other people, to have a sense of playfulness, and form allows me that. So I think that comes through in this collection, perhaps maybe more than other collections of mine.
Do you think that this might be a good time to read Creation Abecedarian?
Sure. So I'll read Creation Abecedarian. And I guess the only thing to say about this poem is that it was written in response to a statement made by the Indian minister in charge of higher education, who said that Darwin's theory of evolution was wrong and wanted it removed from school curricula because, according to him, nobody, including our ancestors, in written or oral, said they ever saw an ape turning into a human being. And that we are children of rishis or sages. So this is Creation Abecedarian. As each day passes, we grow less certain about the universe. Bewildered by black holes and big bangs, our textbooks confuse childbirth with cosmic eggs, skim over the functions of reproduction. Darwin was wrong, they claim, not just about his theory of biological evolution, but about everything. We are descendants of sages. From primordial man's mouth, arms, thighs, feet, we sprang. God is an organizational genius. Even our minister of education, holistic scholar, and yogi believes our forefathers never stated in writing or on their dictaphones that they ever saw an ape jolted into being a man. It never happened. No, of course, our people were daubing their wrists with lotus perfume, while elsewhere others were chiseling rocks. Still, Mary's immaculate hijab notwithstanding, most women I know need to get on all fours to accept beans into their navels, or lay eggs in a petri dish to set the marigolds abloom in spring. Perhaps we're like the pyramids of Giza and must remain enigmatic quandaries, never mind DNA. Yesterday, I was stalked by a cheeky rhesus macaque through the gardens of tamarind in the Theosophical Society. Whenever I stopped to look back at him, he'd stop too and turn quizzically. When I ran, he ran faster until I couldn't tell who was who anymore. The gap between us closed. Valmiki and Virgil, sages both, wrote of transformations in the forest. We are all pushing for reinvention like caterpillars, chewing through xenia, unaware of the rudimentary wings tucked into our bodies. You and I may never be butterflies, but we recognize each other, zoomorphic ancestor. We bow and reach for that invisible thing that beats.
So, here's what I really love about this poem, and then I have a follow-up question. You mentioned play, and that's when I thought, okay, I feel like this is a really good moment to bring in
Mm,
this poem. And when I teach this poem, I'll teach it in terms of play, and I'll teach it to illustrate one specific point, which is when you bring the idea of play to the classroom, students, which is young students specifically, the moment that is, which is the moment in one's life when one is most serious about oneself and one's work, is when one is very young. um, think that play undercuts their ability to be serious, their ability to communicate seriousness and see the world as a serious thing, which it definitely is. And I
mm,
think that this poem is very playful and yet ends and is throughout dealing with something quite serious. So I think that I'd love to hear your thoughts on the reason to interpose these two things and how you get away with being playful. Why is it important to have that play, not take yourself too seriously while taking the world very seriously with your work?
that's a lovely question. And honestly, I I think I'm a very, very serious person. I think you have to be a serious person if you want to be an artist or a writer. To some degree, you have to take it seriously because no one else is going to take it seriously for you. So it does require a sort of seriousness. Um, and yet, you mentioned Kafka earlier on. I think we we really are living in a very, very absurd time, and there is so much to be overwhelmed by in terms of the things that are happening around us. And um it could drown you, it could really set you under to kind of accommodate all these things. And so I found that in order to write seriously about things that are deeply disturbing, I mean, I find it deeply disturbing that the education minister of a country would say something like this. So I could have gone with that tone, oh, look what's happening to us, look what's happening to this country. Because every second day, if you read or pick up an Indian newspaper, it doesn't have to just be India, anywhere across the world, someone in a position of power is saying something ridiculous and changing the lives of said young people. And so it could just get you very, very angry and very upset. And I feel that in a sense that's always hitting one emotional register and tone, and it's like speaking to the converted, and just reaffirming everything. Oh yes, horrible people, they don't know anything, yet here they are in power. And so the poem is a way to challenge but subvert, to be cheeky, to prod, to poke, to do all of these things. And I think why it's necessary for me is that if I feel like I go straight to the point, then it's a very flat poem. It just has the one dimension. And so I found that being able to integrate the sense of play um, is important, because when you bring the play and the seriousness together, or when you bring tragedy and comedy together, then you unfold the absurd. Then you come upon something that feels like, oh, this is an interesting emotion for me humanly, that it's not just one thing, it's a mixture, and I've always found that mixture of emotion very, very powerful as somebody who reads, as somebody who watches, as an audience person myself, as someone who is a receiver of art. I have always been interested in how somebody can make me laugh and cry at the same time, or in the space of a book, or in a poem. So I'm interested in these swerves, let's call them swerves, and I feel like I am trying to, I don't know that that's going to happen. It's not like I set out to do that, but I think it's this sense of a coping mechanism of how to cope with the ridiculousness, or this nature of the things around us, whether it's about climate, or whether it's about women's bodies, or bodies in general, and all these things that I feel very invested in. And I feel that I do have my rage, and that's always there. But this sense of play has become more and more important to me.
I really found your answer fascinating. You're talking about interest and contrast and really technical craft matters. When I was reading that poem and thinking, one, creation, this area, and to connect those two ideas. But that poem, this initial poem that you start everything with, is incredibly flexible. And I thought initially that your answer was going to be related to dance, and how really humor and satire and like that ability is sort of, it's a soft movement, and it's a flexible movement, and that seriousness is a stiffness that you can't maintain continuously. And I thought that one of the things that this book did really well, collecting and arranging the poems in the way that it did, was to take those deep breaths that are flexible and then have hard, sharp turns of the body. That if you had that continuously, all of your joints would break. Or if you were completely flexible, then you would pretend not to have a spine and never say anything worthwhile. So I perhaps watched too many of your like interviews regarding dance earlier and made too many like suppositions and projections. But I wondered if I was maybe perhaps a little bit somewhere in the distance.
Maybe perhaps I lost your last the last thing you said, Lina.
If it's connected in some way, or if I'm just purely projecting your biography onto the page.
No, look, I mean, I don't know. I think the sense of how something happens in the poem, it's it's very mysterious, and I feel that you cannot go in with an idea of a desired effect. When you're doing a movement in dance, you know what your desired effect is, especially if it's a choreography. But there's also the idea of play in dance, where you're trying to arrive at what the movement can be, and the play is the experiment. It's the sort of being there in this sprawl, trying to figure out what is the thing, what is the mode, what is the vehicle that is going to allow you to carry this thing that you want to carry. So for me in this poem, it's like I had a fun encounter with a monkey, where the monkey looked at me and I looked at the monkey, and I was like, oh my God, there is no way that we have not come from monkeys. There is just no way, it is us. I am looking at the mirror. And so so I lead into that sort of final acknowledgement of the heart that beats within the monkey and within me, that we look at each other and we know, not just me, monkey knows too, this sense of recognition, which I thought was funny but also moving, this being chased by the ancestor. But it's coming from also this other place, and so I don't know that I'm going to arrive at this moment, because the poem did not begin there. This thing that happened with the monkey happened a while ago. That was sort of buried somewhere within me, this encounter that I had sort of stored somewhere in my head. But the trigger for the poem is this news item of this statement, and then the poem leads to this image, to this idea of the forest of transformation, of the idea of evolution, of the butterfly, of the idea of not even knowing what we can be, so all this stuff, I don't have this idea before I write the poem. If I do, it's a very, I mean, I don't know that people write poems like that or write anything like that. I think that is the arriving at, whereby you're kind of pushing towards some sense of meaning making, some sense of being able to hold the complexity, the juxtaposition, and then the poem allows you to do that. And that's why poems are so damn great, because once you write the poem, you have made some kind of a bridge, and it's there, and other people are free to walk along this bridge and to experience it in their own ways. And I love your interpretation. Sure, let's go with that too, about the flexibility and the sub, why not? But I just feel like that sense of how we're going to do it, we don't know how we're going to do it, but we feel that we can, and that's why we begin to write the poem, because we feel that there is some connection with all these disparate ideas and thoughts that the poem can bring together.
I feel like the wrong thing to do would be to argue my point further, because you've already given it to me. But I do think that like entering a poem with a willingness to discover is a looseness. Like that's play, right? Like that's that willingness to like discover. And I guess again, I've been doing these for days now, and most of them have been, a lot of them I've had to prep a lot for. This one is just like I have so many questions. So I'm so glad that I have you here. So you've mentioned two things that I really like to go back to. One is this idea of identity as containment of subject. Who gets to write what? And you just mentioned this, like I know and the monkey knows, which is such a stretch of imagination unto itself, and that you get to write that is fascinating. And it also falls until an entire subgenre of writers that do that, interestingly a lot of them women, uh, who imagine themselves into the therianthropy of another mind. Virginia Woolf imagines herself within the moth. Annie Dillard imagines herself exchanging minds with the weasel. And here you are understanding that you are understood by a monkey, which is fascinating and possibly deserves a longer study unto itself. But I'm curious, how do we determine, like how do you determine what the limitations of, like, where will I go, where can I go with my mind, and when does it feel wrong, not just in my own work but in others?
It's a question of pushing, I suppose, at certain boundaries. And you know I think if I think about it musically, that sense of the wrongness comes in the sense of sound. And there are poems that I really struggled with until I found the right form for it. So I felt like I wanted to write something, and if I'm going to write about it, then it better be a certain way. It better be respectful to the situation, or it has to honor certain things. So I'm aware of that, but I don't want to not write it just because I'm scared that it won't work. So it requires a kind of going in and going in and going in, um, before you can find the right tone. And it's not the same tone with every poem. I have a poem in here called After Shooting at a Maternity Clinic in Kabul. Um, and that poem took a long time to arrive at how to comprehend this particular horror. I have a lot of poems which are in this particular collection, which are responses to current events. And again, that whole idea of, should poets be writing and responding immediately to something that's happening in the news? How do you do it? How do you change the language of news speak and use it in a poem, without diluting it, or by adding something to it, or by creating something else? And so I think, like, different, there's no way of knowing, unless to yourself you develop a sense of an ear. I don't know who decides whether something is right or wrong. I think you have to sort of launch yourself into what you want to explore and sit with it. And time is usually some kind of um, you know time plays some element in it. You sit with it a while, you put it in the drawer, you wait,
Mhm.
and then you see if it still holds in some way. But really, it's to do with the ear and the sound. And if it feels that it's not striking the wrong note, then I feel confident to push ahead. But one never knows.
Mm. Can I? So I think I'm cobbling together an answer from your previous answers, and I'm wondering what you think about my Frankensteining, like a further answer from your previous ones. You you mentioned when we're talking about play, sort of a willingness to understand, to enter, to follow, and to see what happens, right? Not just to see what happens, but what can you understand from the exercise of the poem. So, like, that's why a poem is so great. And as you're talking about this now, like, it's musical, it's in the ear, it's a lot in the feeling of it ultimately. So I'm wondering if part of what's happening here, and I should have mentioned this. I'm from Colombia. I'm not from the U.S. You can probably tell from my accent. So neither one of us are necessarily coming from the dominant, hegemonic, like, powers and representation. And we've probably both experienced people outside of our specific groups coming in and having those representations. And I've encountered that. And I also want very much to defend Virginia Woolf writing Septimus in Mrs. Dalloway and imagining her way into that place. I think, especially from what you were mentioning, like that willingness to enter the poem and find out. I think the difference is that some enter the poem wanting to find out, and some enter the poem wanting to explain or to tell. And to me,
Mm.
like, that's the difference between those two. And I'm wondering what you might think. One is
Yeah.
didactic and one explores. And exploring is play. And it also takes a lot more work. Whereas a lot of people will enter and tell you, yes, I will write a story from the point of view of a transgender individual, and they will be dumb and evil and stupid and very shallow, and then they will pass by. And then they are not writing to explore, to understand, or to sort of play with. They're writing to convince.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that that sense of unknowing is a very important aspect of writing, and the uncertainty is important. It's good to keep asking yourself, am I doing this right? Am I getting it right? Is this, should I be doing this at all? I think those are very important questions that you never stop asking. Not like, oh, I have the right to write about whatever I want and here it is. And I also feel like that sense of unexpected revelation or epiphany in the poem is part of why we write it, because yeah, if you're being didactic, you say, this is what I'm going to do with my poem, I'm going to say this, and that's the poem. That poem has then reduced in its layering and its complexity, in my opinion. So I think that this this dithering around in this space of unknowingness is the very scary and difficult part of writing. The beginning, being in that space where you feel like you're moving towards something but you don't know what. And I think that that's how it is. And even if you're a writer who's sort of very, very precise and very, very organized, if you're a writer who plans out their novels and knows where you're going to begin, even for that writer, there is this element of suddenly coming upon something, and and that has to be a part of the process. And I think that's when I'm surprised, or when something unexpected like that happens, then I get excited, because it's almost like this revelation that I want, but I just don't know what it is before I have the poem. Otherwise, it's worthless to me. Then it's propaganda. It's just like, okay, here's me ranting on about something, which is not
Yeah,
poetry.
propaganda sells, so it is tempting to write propaganda from time to time. But this definitely does not feel like propaganda if you ever felt like that was a fear. I'm going to shift to more perhaps shallow but perhaps more playful questions. Do you have a favorite poem in your book? Do you have one that kind of like lingers with
No, I don't actually. I have a few that I come back to, and I think that I'm maybe more fond of than other poems. I think that happens in a collection that, there are certain poems that come to represent the book in a way, and
you?
um, when you're writing them, I'm also not a person who writes. I've always wanted to be that kind of poet who has this idea for a big narrative poetic structure with interlinked poems, and they're all working towards this grand scheme. I just don't write in that fashion. So it's individual poems, and then suddenly I look at them and I think, oh, I think I have a book, or I'm getting towards a book length, and it's this, oh, great, wonderful moment. And so it's really difficult because, again, it's not very artful, it's not very planned, it's just sort of this fumbling. And I really hope to one day have the ambition for this great narrative book. Maybe I'll get there, but I think in the sense of writing poems, it's always very individual. The individual poem that you're obsessed with at the time of writing it, and then it goes
Hmm.
into this collection, and they all belong together in some way. But there are poems that tend to be the ones that you kind of come back to again and again. So for me, one of the poems in this book is Advice to Pliny the Elder, Big Daddy of
Yeah.
Mansplainers. I
Yeah.
really enjoyed writing that poem. It gave me a lot of uh yeah, it gave me again a lot of power. It's like, here I am speaking back to Pliny, the little know-it-all, not little, big know-it-all Pliny, and being able to do that in my poem as a way of crossing time and trying to make some redress and trying to, it has a little bit of sass, and again, those same things that I spoke about, which is like combining different tonal registers within a poem and moving into, I think, some serious ideas and serious things. Talking about menstruation and the fact that right now in India there are temples that women cannot enter if they are menstruating. So it's not like, oh, this was 2000 years ago and haha, look how they were then and look how we are now. It's like, oh, that was 2000 years ago, and look, now it's
um,
still like this. So
it's still relevant. So, final shallow question. Um, you've done a lot of these interviews, you've been talking about this book for a while. Do you have a question the least favorite question that you get consistently, and your favorite question that no one ever asks you?
oh no, because I don't remember interviews so much. I mean, I don't have a sense of, I don't think I've been surprised so much by a question for a very long time. I remember many, many, many years ago at a literary festival, I was asked, how I thought the art of writing resembles the art of miniature painting, and that threw me. I was like, oh, I have literally no response for this question. I'm going to pass it along. It was really a very I mean, interesting question. I just felt like my
Very
brain was
interesting.
empty at that time, and I thought, oh, okay.
You'd,
But
you'd also you'd have to know things about miniature painting. Do you know anything about miniature
No, I mean,
painting?
I've really gotten into miniature painting recently, but at the
Oh,
time,
never
I
mind.
knew,
Never mind.
I knew at the time, this was a long time ago, I knew zero, zero. I just knew that there was such a thing as miniature painting. But no, I mean, I don't dislike any question, because I think honestly, you can ask the same question and you can ask it at different times in a day. You can ask it in different ways. You can ask it in different days, and I will always answer a differently. There's not like a stock answer even to the same question. So that's good, because otherwise it would be really boring to do interviews.
That makes sense. My least, I write a lot about war and all this violence and brutality. My least favorite question is always, how do you self-care? And I'm like,
Oh.
uh, so that's my go-to. But now that we've brought it back,
Oh, I
now
have
that
a
we know,
question. I have a
oh,
question.
go on.
Well, no, it's just I think sometimes a question arrives which is too large, and I think it's an unfair question. But like on international stages, sort of being asked to say like to describe the condition of women in India, and I just feel like, oh no, please don't ask me that. And along those lines, like feeling like you're
Mm.
some kind of ambassador of the I don't know. And you're not, you're a poet. And your work should speak for what you think about certain things. But I think like that's the kind of question that I feel like, oh, I'm not really sure how to go into this. But even that I can answer, in whatever
The,
mood I'm in, I'll answer it.
that's very fair when people ask you to represent accurately 1 billion people. Like that's a very fair question to be a little bit miffed by. So I feel like fate has brought me to this moment. A long time ago, you said somebody asked you how writing was, like miniature painting, and at the time you weren't into it, but now you are. Would you like to answer that question now that you know about both?
Well, yeah, I could actually. Well, because I was writing about it recently, and there's a lot of elements in miniature painting where there are these layers, and basically this sense of the painting being revealed as you go through the layers. It's very intricate. There's a lot of potential for metaphor and things that were previously hidden, the invisible becoming visible, and all of these things that also writers are interested in. But I came across this amazing beautiful word, the of the process, which is called the kullai, which is the opening up of the painting, which is literally the opening up of the eyes, and this sense of the painting then suddenly being able to see itself. And I hope that I'm interpreting that right, but I feel that way about a poem as well, whereby you have all these raw materials and you have all these stars, and then at some point the poem begins to take shape, and you get excited because this is not yet a poem, but it's going to become a poem. I know there's a poem in there. And then you work on it, you work on it, work you. And then there is this moment of revelation of the poem revealing itself to you, to itself, however you want to see it. And it's this really magical moment when it happens, because that's coming back to what you were saying about how do you know, and that sense of um that sense of understanding or believing that this is this magical thing has happened, and that you've somehow done it and you don't know how, but it's in that process of somehow the poem freeing or opening itself up in a way that the painting does. So yeah, that's how poems could be likened to miniature painting.
Perfect. See, a good interview is also like a poem. You don't know what you're going to find out until like the very end of it. And now I know exactly how poems are like miniature painting, and I am much better for it, as I'm sure everybody else who's watching this is. I cannot thank you enough for your time. This has been chaotic and wild, and possibly my favorite interview of all day, if not all festival. I hope you have a wonderful day. And if you are ever around Chicago, please call me up. I live in Hyde Park.